Greetings, Adam's child. Welcome to this week's sermon where we examine yet another myth of the Fallout franchise. What's right and what's wrong in our never-ending pursuit of knowledge. So crank up the rads and let's dissect yet another myth. One of the uncritically accepted myths of the Fallout games is that the very nuclear weapons that brought about the end of the old world were different from those that sit in the missile silos and bomb bays of our universe. To use the common refrain, Fallout's bombs were small and dirty. That is to say that in Fallout they opted for less destructive power in their nuclear weapons in exchange for more and longer lasting radiation and radioactive fallout. To some, this means that Fallout's bombs were dirty bombs, specially created to do the maximum amount of radiological damage possible, or that they were all fission-based bombs rather than the primarily fusion-based designs that our real-world military uses, or that Fallout's nukes were probably around the same size as those dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. The thing is, while one or all of these may be true, the lore never actually says such things. And these claims that are bandied about on the internet rely on inferences and assumptions about the game world, along with one very important section of information written in the Fallout 1 game guide that started it all. Game guides are usually good authoritative sources for lore, although they are not immune to error, as sometimes they don't align perfectly with the game. What we're interested in though is right near the beginning of the survival guide, starting quite literally on the second page of text under the heading Nuclear Blast Effects. Chris Taylor, the lead designer of the first Fallout, did a great job consolidating paragraphs of interesting nuclear weapon related information in the first several pages of the survival guide. Everything from the ways nuclear weapons kill and cause damage, to the whats and whys of mushroom clouds, and near the end on page 7, he finally gets to the meat and potatoes of this myth. The last paragraph states, "The megaton class weapons have been largely retired, being replaced with much smaller warheads. The yield of a modern strategic warhead is, with few exceptions, now typically in the range of 200 to 750 kilotons. When high-yield weapons were retired in favor of more numerous, lower-yield weapons, it increased the fallout risk." That seems pretty cut and dry. This whole section on nuclear weapons is from Vault Tech's very own High Energy Weapons FAQ in order to help Vault 13's dwellers better understand how the Vault protects them. But a very critical point to understand about this text is that it describes exactly what happened in the real world, our world. While the 1950s and 60s saw the two main rival militaries, the United States and the USSR, creating increasingly large and destructive nuclear bombs, that trend would reverse starting in the 1970s and continue to the present. As delivery systems became ever more accurate, testing and modeling showed that multiple high-precision but smaller warheads were far more effective and harder to stop than one large bomb. Thus, systems like multiple independent reentry vehicle platforms, or MIRVs, or nuclear-equipped cruise missiles are more destructive, and these, along with air-dropped nuclear ordnance, became the main forms of delivery. This means that according to the survival guide, nuclear weapons in the Fallout universe were no smaller than in ours. This miniaturization phenomenon was not only in Fallout. It mirrors exactly what happened in our world after the 1970s. According to this entry that is often cited for this myth, that Fallout's bombs were much smaller, the Fallout universe was no different from ours in this respect. This passage does not say what many people think it does. Nowhere else is it stated that Fallout's bombs were smaller or more radioactive than real-world nukes. And with that one primary source from the game guide properly contextualized and understood, we can only justify this myth by what we see and encounter in-game. The evidence for and against is, well, all over the place, making it difficult to draw any sort of conclusion. But let's first look at the in-game evidence that would support this myth. We will look at craters, mushroom clouds, and anything else we can try to determine if the explosions that ended the world really were smaller and more radioactive than in our world. Fallout 3 has many craters scattered throughout the map, since it takes place at the once proud capital of the good old US of A and was a prime target for the Chinese. Probably the target if we're being honest. These craters can be useful in determining how large the detonations were that created them, which requires a bit of an explanation. A now pretty well-known site that lets you see the potential effects of nuclear detonations, called NukeMap, has a wealth of information that it pulls from to estimate many things about a nuclear detonation, including the blast radius, mushroom cloud height, and crater radius. And this will be the primary tool to estimate the yield or explosive power of the warhead that created the crater. The second important point is that multiple lines of evidence point to the fact that nuclear weapons in the Fallout world were detonated at or very near ground level. This is a very important point because the majority of nuclear ordnance is blown up well above ground level in the real world, which is known as an airburst, because overlapping shock waves end up being much more destructive. However, the few instances we see a warhead actually detonate, like in Fallout 76, it absolutely makes it all the way back to Earth before blowing up. Craters were measured when I georeferenced the Fallout world map onto a real-world map and then used a measurement tool to finally get the crater's diameter. The largest crater in the whole of Fallout 3 is near Fort Bannister, a former military base that is now a mercenary stronghold under the command of Talon Company. This massive crater is approximately 355 meters or 388 yards in diameter, which corresponds approximately to a 770 kiloton surface detonation, which is only 20 kilotons outside the range that the Vault Dweller Survival Guide prescribed, which again was between 200 and 750. Seeing as this is the largest of all the craters that could be easily measured, the estimated yields only go down from here. A large crater north of the Springvale Elementary School is estimated at 280 kilotons. An easily visible crater south of the map is also 250 kilotons, and a smaller one in the north is 118 kilotons. These are all roughly in that 200 to 750 range, although if the crater that Megaton was built in is an unmodified bomb crater, it would be the biggest of all of them, at an estimated 5.8 megatons, which would be much too large for this theory. However, we can't be sure Megaton was actually built in a nuclear crater, since it would be the only one in Fallout 3 that is not radioactive, and the water at the bottom doesn't count. Nearly all the water in the game is radioactive. Or we can't be sure that the crater wasn't modified and dug out or enlarged as the town was settled and built up. Fallout New Vegas is an interesting one because while the map will georeference pretty well against the real world, the scale is really off. Now, the scaling is always a little wonky with these games. They are fitting large areas and cities into a game of dozens of gigs or less, but it was so off for New Vegas that it didn't make sense to rely on the georeference data. The craters that we observe near Black Mountain, for instance, are not that much larger in diameter than many of the craters in Fallout 3, even though they were measuring at around half a kilometer or 0.3 miles in diameter. This just seems wrong, since we can run across the width of the crater in only 6 seconds. So, since the relative scale of these New Vegas craters compared to our in-game character is similar to the ones in Fallout 3, we will assume that nearly all the bombs in New Vegas have similar yields to those in Fallout 3, which is within the 200 to 750 kiloton range, and sometimes even smaller. Additionally, there is one of 3 notable craters in Fallout 4 where the estimated yield is in the lowish range that is often cited. The crater south of Boston, near the Wilson Automatoys HQ, that was estimated at 550 kilotons. Although, the level of destruction around the crater looks nothing even close to that. This nuke obliterated an overpass and maybe a few buildings, so it could be argued that it was smaller than what the crater would indicate. So 550 kilotons would be the theoretical maximum. Either way, all evidence points to this being a warhead on the smaller side. With the craters in Fallout 3 and New Vegas, and one in Fallout 4 supporting the small bomb theory, I took a look at a special event we can trigger in Fallout 3, namely the detonation of the bomb in Megaton. As I bring division to my faithful brothers and sisters of Adam, I time the shockwave from the point of detonation to when it knocks stuff off the table in front of us. Now, this method necessitated a different approach where I had to look at graphs and do some algebra that are found in a publication called The Effects of Nuclear Weapons by Samuel Gladstone and Philip Dolan. I estimated the yield of the megaton bomb to be around 102 kilotons, which is definitely on the smaller side. However, we don't know what kind of effects having the bomb fairly far down inside of a crater or pit could have had on the blast wave, so it's possible that I underestimated the yield. The bomb design is modeled after the US Mark III bomb, otherwise known as the Fat Man, that was dropped on Nagasaki near the end of World War II. And the Mark III itself had a 21 kiloton yield. However, just because something in Fallout looks similar to another historical object does not mean they are the same. The most recent piece of Fallout media to come out is the Fallout TV show, which had a memorable pre-war portion in the first episode where we got to see nuclear weapons being deployed against Los Angeles on the fateful day of October 23rd, 2077. The very first detonation that we see gives us a visible shockwave that we can time, and therefore we can use a similar method for Fallout 3's megaton bomb. Cooper Howard and his daughter were most likely at a birthday party in the Hollywood Hills area, based on a later scene where they are riding down a street with the Griffith Observatory in plain view as warheads detonate. Although there is a cut during the shockwave scene, we lose very little time, and so it was timed at approximately 6 seconds. Since I didn't have an exact distance, I plugged in different values for various yields and then plotted the approximate distance they would have to be from the Hollywood Hills area, shown by the dots you see here. It became clear that anything beyond 100 kilotons just made no sense, since we end up in the water, which the explosion is very obviously not in. Using a few more clues, namely that Coop and his daughter are not close enough to be burned by the intense heat of the detonation, which is called the thermal radiation radius, and since the only damage around them was rather superficial, with tossed patio furniture and shattered glass, it meant they were within the light damage radius. Using this information would mean that it would be in the 10 to 20 kiloton range, which would make it approximately as powerful as the atomic bombs used in World War II. However, I do really need to acknowledge that this very first explosion is super weird, especially when we compare it to the other bombs we see detonate only moments later. After an intense flash, we see a very wide and fairly tall cloud of smoke or ash. It slowly grows in height, showing the first flickers of fire until it starts to assume an unmistakable mushroom cloud shape. And it's only after many moments pass that we see the shockwave tear across the city and toward our main characters. All other detonations that we see form a tall mushroom cloud quite quickly after detonation, and their shockwave is also nearly instantaneous. This could cause issues with our calculations, and it's worth considering why and what made this first detonation so weird. Of course, it could be just a case of heavy artistic license to heighten the experience of the first of many bombs that would herald the end of the old world, but outside of that, there are a few considerations. If this explosion was buried or originated underground, perhaps that could explain some of the strangeness that we see. It's also possible that there were multiple detonations or a combination of both of these possibilities. I would be interested to hear your thoughts and theories regarding this very strange detonation. The shining beacon of freedom and democracy, Liberty Prime, has two primary armaments, a giant laser in his head and a fat stack of nuclear bombs. We get to see these bombs in action, which in Fallout 4 we know to be a type called Mark 28, which had been made for aircraft, but at some point were being retrofitted to fit onto ICBMs before the Great War stopped the project dead. These bombs, when used by Liberty Prime, are quite powerful, don't get me wrong, but they aren't significantly more powerful than mini nukes. These things are not going to destroy a city block anytime soon. Interestingly, in the real world, the United States had Mark 28 bombs that had been renamed to B-28 that were made to be dropped by aircraft. Just like in Fallout, however, their yield was much bigger, ranging from 70 kilotons to over a megaton. Although these bombs may have been tactical rather than strategic, and therefore much smaller than we would expect, they were being fitted to ICBMs, which are traditionally not considered tactical weapon delivery systems. As far as bomb power, those are the only pieces of evidence for smaller yield weapons being deployed. However, that only addresses half of the myth. The second half is that Fallout's bombs are supposed to be much more radioactive than the real world. The Vault Dweller Survival Guide says that the fallout risk increased with lower yield weapons, and there indeed is evidence for this, although it's not likely what most people think. There are a few areas where we can visit ground zero of a nuclear detonation not long after it occurred, and therefore we can get some pretty recent radiation readings. Once again, Megaton in Fallout 3 will be a case study where only an hour after detonation, we can measure the crater peaking at 11 rads per second. Although many factors can affect this, modern thermonuclear weapons average at about 30 grays per hour, which converts to 3,000 rads per hour. That means the megaton detonation is much more radioactive, since after converting it sits at 396 grays per hour an hour after detonation, a whole order of magnitude higher than the 30 average that is expected in the real world. The nukes that can be dropped in Fallout 76 are even more radioactive, with radiation levels at 59 rads per second anywhere within the blast zone. This equates to 4,248 grays per hour, which is 2 orders of magnitude greater, but that's still not the highest. The Dry Wells detonation site that the Courier can visit in Fallout New Vegas, should they choose to nuke the Legion at the end of the Lonesome Road add-on, has an eye-watering, in a good way, max of 314 rads per second at the crater. That equates to 11,160 grays per hour, 3 orders of magnitude higher than what we would expect in the real world. It really does seem as though nuclear weapons in Fallout are much more radioactive than the conventional nuclear weapons of our world. However, there is a very important consideration. There is a generally recognized rule that lets you estimate the amount of radioactivity that will remain after a nuclear blast, called the Rule of Sevens. For every 7-fold increase in time, radioactivity decreases by a factor of 10. Or I like to simplify it like this: irradiated 7-fold. Alright, simply said, at hour 0, we have 100% of the initial radiation dose hanging around, but by hour 7, there is only 10%. By 49 hours, which is a bit over 2 days, radiation is at 1%. And at only 343 hours or 2 weeks, radiation levels are only 0.1%. Most of the Fallout games take place roughly between 100 to 200 years after the Great War, with the exception of Fallout 76, which means, that's a lot of zeros. The expected amount of radiation after 200 years for that super radioactive Dry Wells detonation that we measured would be 0.000000, was that 6 zeros? 16% of its initial radioactivity. To put that number in perspective, it's approximately how much love the average New Vegas fan has for Todd Howard. It is an amount so low as to be essentially indistinguishable from background radiation. So these bombs, many of which were used in the Great War, and some of which have laid around dormant, waiting for us to find them and use them against our post-war enemies, would have undetectable levels of radiation 200 years after the Great War. That's not what we see in-game at all. The Capital Wasteland has many, many pockets of radiation, and nearly all consumables are irradiated. Fallout 4 has many pockets of radiation, and an entire area called the Glowing Sea that is still heavily inundated with radiation. New Vegas has a number of irradiated craters, and the first Fallout has the Glow, another intensely radioactive area that shouldn't still be so hot. What this seems to mean is that with the few examples we could examine in-game, Bombs do appear to give off more radioactivity, which would have severe consequences for the survivors of the Great War. But after so many years after the Great War, there shouldn't be any detectable radiation, but there still very much is. This shows at the end of the day, radiation just works differently in the Fallout universe than our own, which is an important thing to remember about our beloved Fallout. Some of that confirming evidence is pretty convincing, and it appears as though Fallout's bombs were indeed dirtier. But now it's time to look at the evidence that is contrary to the idea that the bombs in Fallout were much smaller than in our world. While nearly all craters in Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas were calculated as being the result of rather small detonations, the same cannot be said for the craters we see in the first Fallout, Fallout 2, Fallout Tactics, and most of Fallout 4. The first Fallout, taking place 84 years after the events of the Great War, bears the scars of that engagement, with multiple noticeable craters on the surface that are only seen when inspecting the overworld map, and one area is still baking under copious amounts of beautiful, holy radiation, a place adequately referred to as the Glow. I've talked about these craters in at least 2 different videos before, since I've already georeferenced and measured them all. The 2 most interesting craters, in my humble, atom-inspired opinion, would be the largest one almost smack dab in the middle of Los Angeles, and the strange crater centered on the West Tech Research Facility south of the city. The West Tech Research Facility had been where FEV research started before it was moved elsewhere when the military took over the project, but the facility continued to do a tremendous amount of research and development for the United States war effort, since West Tech was the biggest military contractor in the pre-war and the initial creators of the vaunted and war-winning power armor. It comes as no surprise then that it was a priority target for the Chinese, who bombed it so hard that 94 years later, it is awash in radiation. This crater has an irregular shape, but critically, the approximate diameter of this crater is 9 miles or 14 kilometers wide, which is absolutely asinine. The largest nuclear crater in the real world is the Sedan crater, which is only 1,280 feet or 390 meters in diameter, and achieved this crater size not so much because of its explosive power, but because it was an underground explosion. Another way to put this crater size into perspective is the very large and well-preserved impact crater near Flagstaff, Arizona, creatively called the Meteor Crater, has a crater diameter of 0.75 miles or 1.2 kilometers, and its explosive yield has been estimated at 10 megatons, which is far larger than most modern nuclear weapons, and according to the Vault Dweller Survival Guide, larger than most Fallout nuclear weapons too. A 10 megaton impact, which is 10,000 kilotons, created a crater that is almost 11 times smaller than the crater that exists at the center of the Glow in the first Fallout, which would seem to be evidence that enormously massive bombs were made and used in the Fallout world. However, the irregular shape of the crater, rather than being nearly spherical like most craters, could indicate that a number of nuclear bombs impacted very close to each other, which could explain the crater size. Although again, those bombs would still be much larger than the 200 to 750 kiloton range to be visible on the world map. The biggest crater of all, though, is in the middle of the city, and the crater has an earth-shattering, quite literally, 22-mile or 35.5 kilometer wide crater from rim to rim. This nearly perfectly circular crater does not appear to be the result of multiple close impacts like down in the Glow, unless these impacts were stacked right on top of each other with incredible precision, which is both unlikely and also less effective, because the entire point behind the shift towards smaller yield but more numerous warheads was to spread out the damage. All the other craters we see on the map are enormous and quite circular, with the 14-kilometer wide Glow crater being the smallest and most irregular of the bunch. If these crater sizes are to be believed, this would indicate a destructive force so large it exceeds the 100 megaton limit for nuke map. So I can't even begin to tell you how big they should be, and the only things that we can start to use as comparisons are large asteroid impacts. Fallout 2 and Fallout Tactics similarly show craters that are absurdly large, similar to what is seen in the first Fallout, with nearly perfect circular shapes that make multiple impacts right on top of each other like a nuclear Robin Hood seem extremely unlikely. Fallout 2 with its 11.2 mile or 18 kilometer crater, and Tactics with tons of visible craters that measure anywhere from 4.5 miles or 7.5 kilometers to an insane 15 mile or 24 kilometers in diameter. Interestingly, Fallout games developed under Bethesda, which is every game after and including Fallout 3, show craters that are a good deal smaller than the first games. We mentioned the craters in Fallout 3 and New Vegas, the biggest of which are all estimated to be a lot smaller than 1 megaton, but Fallout 4 is different. Although it had one crater that was on the smaller side, the Cambridge crater was a little bigger and a lot deeper, and was estimated to be around 870 kilotons based on the nuke map, although the surrounding damage would make that high of an estimation doubtful. The real spectacle here, though, is the holy site of Adam's Crater in the middle of the glowing sea, a barren landscape of ruin and radiation that is purportedly the site of the massive detonation we witnessed firsthand in the pre-war segment of Fallout 4, and measuring this big old crater leads to an estimation around 38 megatons based on nuke map. That is enormous. So I also did the yield estimation based on the speed of the shockwave that we see in the pre-war part of the game, and this resulted in a size of 1.3 megatons. That is a very large spread. However, both of those values are well above the range that has been mentioned several times. So nearly every crater in the early games, and 2 in Fallout 4, could only have been made by very large bombs, some ridiculously large and bigger than what we have in modern arsenals, but we can also measure and observe the radius of destruction from a nuclear detonation in Fallout 76. Upon launching a nuclear-tipped missile, when it detonates on some poor patch of Appalachian dirt, come on, don't they have it hard already? There is a consistent circular area of destruction. Destructible objects like a player's camp will be destroyed, and any players that remain in this area will be killed instantly. This radius also marks a very abrupt wall of radiation. Crossing the line will drench you in holy rads to the tune of 59, or really 60, rads per second, an amount that will quickly kill any character not endowed with Adam's blessing. Since we have an established radius here, we could again use the nuke map because it gives us different radii, like how big the fireball is, a radiation radius, a heavy blast damage radius, and so on. Since being inside the blast radius will instantly kill anyone, it could be the heavy blast damage radius, it could be the radiation radius, which is the area that is subjected to over 500 rem of ionizing radiation, which is recognized as the lethal dose, or the thermal radiation radius, which marks the area where people will suffer third-degree burns from the burst of energy from the detonation. When considering which of these radii best reflects the blast zone of Fallout 76, the heavy blast zone and the lethal radiation radii make the most sense, but those are also 2 of the smallest. So, georeferencing the Fallout 76 map, and then measuring the blast zone diameter, I measured 15 miles or 24 kilometers, which, when referenced with blasts of various yields in nuke map, made a few things pretty clear. Having the most lethal and destructive radii have a similar radius would make the explosion absolutely massive. So to have the most conservative estimate possible, a minimum size if you will, I fit the measured diameter to the thermal radiation radius. You know, the one where if you're not behind shelter, you get burned to a crisp. This still ended up being a large explosion at 1.3 megatons, at an absolute minimum. Somehow, the exact same size I estimated for the Fallout 4 intro explosion using an entirely different method. The last and really easy to miss contrary evidence is in one of the many Fallout 3 promotional trailers. The back page article of an issue of the Capital Post, seemingly the most prolific newspaper in the pre-war, is titled something super bomb tested. And the picture below shows a large mushroom cloud flanked on all sides by 4 smaller mushroom clouds. You know, when your mushroom cloud has mushroom clouds, things are getting crazy. Testing some sort of new super bomb could very well be a propaganda piece or a way to intimidate the Chinese, who the US had just started fighting since the front page article speaks of the Chinese invasion of Alaska. There's no way to know for sure, but the presence of some sort of super bomb with multiple mushroom clouds indicates that the US had and was interested in large bombs, in contradiction to the theory that Fallout's bombs were tiny. As a quick aside, there's an additional contradiction, not to the myth, but to the Vault Dweller Survival Guide entry, that mentioned a shift towards smaller, more numerous warheads in both the real world and in Fallout. The missiles that we see launched in Lonesome Road that can blow up part of the NCR or Legion territory show one large impact crater, meaning that one warhead was used and not multiple smaller warheads that modern missiles are equipped with. Additionally, we can see the warhead from a launched missile in Fallout 76 come back to Earth and detonate when it impacts the surface. And once again, we see just one big warhead and not multiple. So it seems that in the Fallout world, they did not move towards multiple smaller warheads like the survival guide says. Alright, so I've done the math. I used Nuke Map, mapped Fallout maps to the real world, time shockwaves, and whatever the hell else I rambled on about for the last little while. What does it all mean? I'm usually not one to tell you what to think, rather present information and let you decide. But all this information gives positive confirmation for only one aspect of the myth that says that Fallout's bombs were small and dirty, like your mom. The few detonations that we can observe in-game and explore the detonation area directly show us that the amount of radiation far exceeds what is expected of explosions in the real world. The size of these blasts, though, is all over the place, and there does not seem to be any sort of consensus. Early games have meteor-sized craters. Fallout 3 and New Vegas have craters that reflect smaller bombs, and Fallout 4 has both. Other investigations where I timed the shockwave are also split. In Fallout 3 and the TV show, it supports the small bomb claim, while in Fallout 4 it is evidence of a detonation greater than a megaton. Lastly, investigating the blast radius of a nuke in Fallout 76 also demonstrates that the nukes are quite large, even with the most conservative estimates. Really, it seems that nuclear arsenals were quite varied, with smaller aircraft bombs and missile-launched warheads between 200 and 750 kilotons, but also very large and destructive warheads that often exceed a megaton. We can confidently say that bombs are in every single instance except the TV show detonation, which, has weird circumstances, are more powerful than the ones dropped in World War II, which were only around the 20 kiloton mark, so we should definitely stop saying that. We can also confidently say that they are not all fission-based weapons, because the theoretical limit of fission-based weapons is estimated to be not far beyond 50 megatons, which, don't get me wrong, is incredibly powerful, but the craters we see in many games would require much more powerful bombs. The other two positions we can confidently take are, 1, that the Vault Dweller Survival Guide does not say that Fallout's bombs were smaller than in our world. It actually says the opposite, and that the Fallout world made the exact same switch as our world, moving from high-yield nuclear weapons to multiple smaller-yield weapons. And 2, that it's just not true. According to all the available in-game information, it hasn't been true since the very first game with its ridiculously large craters. So when we discuss these things, it would behoove us to know what's right, what's wrong, and what's ambiguous when it comes to Fallout's lore. Of course, out-of-universe explanations would say that each game wanted to reflect the ravages of nuclear weapons regardless of their scale. So, showing craters in the Fallout Tactics map, which covers almost a third of the United States, would have to be huge in order to be visible. Whereas Fallout 3 and New Vegas would have to have smaller craters because their worlds are scaled-down versions of actual metropolitan areas. I could have said that from the start and been done with it all, but where's the fun in that? What are your thoughts about this myth? I would like to hear what you have to say, and if there's anything I missed that you think would change the calculus. A huge thanks for making it this far, and if you like what I do, then support me whatever way you want. I'm just glad you're here. You can go take the ultimate step and become a YouTube member or patron, like all these fine people you see on screen now. I would like to personally thank new supporters, Troll of Duty 007, nice, Brad Thompson, Maxwell Dojo, Matt, Smiler, and Jacob the Autist. And of course, welcome back to everyone who rejoined. I see you, and I appreciate it. As always, a special thank you to my top tier All to Adam supporters, Acrid B, Gardner Minshew Simp, Dominic White, Tapey Poopy, Juan Vader, The Bread Man, Tyler Eaton, Owen Balzer, and 94, Tessa Storm, The Love Mummy, Shallow Fire 13, Phantom Inc., Tatoranus, Ace Jacobs, and Cheesy Presto. Adam is pleased. Please take care of yourselves and all of Adam's creations. Adam has big plans for all of us, and I will see you soon.